The dashcam light flickered across her face as the officer barked for her to step out of the vehicle. Rain hit the asphalt like static, the night split by blue and red flashes. Her hand stayed steady on the steering wheel, movement slow, deliberate. Calm, in a moment meant to break her composure. He was already angry. He'd expected fear, the kind that made people fumble for words. But this woman wasn't trembling. She wasn't apologizing. She was watching him, not with defiance, but with something colder. Assessment. He demanded her license again, louder this time, his voice cracking through the rain. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to argue, just a quiet sentence that froze the air around them. A sentence that would later echo in a courtroom when everything he thought he controlled began to collapse. But that night, he didn't see it coming. All he saw was a woman who refused to shrink, and he never knew the same woman would ruin him. The night was heavy, the kind of silence that presses down between the low hum of rain and the hiss of tires against wet asphalt. A silver sedan rolled to a quiet stop on a lonely stretch of highway, tail lights glowing like dying embers. Seconds later, the reflection of red and blue lights cut across the rear window. The siren wailed once, short, sharp, and final, the sound of authority demanding obedience. She inhaled slowly, eyes steady on the mirrors. No panic, no curse under her breath, just stillness. The officer stepped out of his cruiser, his flashlight slicing through the rain like a weapon. The beam caught her face, calm, unreadable, framed by the sheen of moisture on the glass. He approached with the swagger of someone too used to being obeyed. The badge gleamed under the strobe, a symbol he'd worn so long it had become part of his skin. To him, this was routine. A stop, a warning, a lecture, maybe a citation. He'd already decided how it would go before he even reached the window. She lowered it halfway, enough for him to see her eyes. That was all it took for the energy to shift. He expected nerves, not poise. Expected excuses, not silence. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap, trailing down his cheek as he asked for her license. She handed it over with steady fingers. No tremor, no explanation, no rush to justify herself. The kind of composure that irritated men like him because it left no cracks to exploit. He glanced at the name, muttered something about driving too fast for conditions, and leaned closer than necessary. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint trace of cologne. Expensive, restrained. Her eyes didn't flinch. The light of his flashlight trembled slightly as he moved it from her hands to her uniform jacket. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. The faint outline of insignia, a patch, a rank he didn't recognize, or maybe didn't want to. He straightened, cleared his throat and started his script again, firmer this time. The voice of authority doing what it did best, remind others who was in charge. But there was something about her silence that unnerved him. The rain got heavier, thundering against the roof. Each drop seemed to underline the tension tightening between them. He told her to step out. She didn't argue. The door opened with a slow, deliberate click. When she stepped into the rain, it wasn't with submission. It was control, pure and effortless. She stood still under the flashing lights, hands visible, expression neutral. Her posture said what her words didn't need to. He told her she'd violated procedure. She said nothing. He told her to stay where she was. Still, silence. Then she lifted her head, the faint gleam of her insignia now fully visible under the cruiser's lights. It caught the reflection of his badge, two emblems of power, now staring each other down in the cold rain. He faltered. Just enough for her to notice. People talk about moments that change lives, but they rarely recognize them when they're happening. For him, this was one. That brief, fragile hesitation would later become the centerpiece of a viral video, the subject of heated debates, and the reason lawyers would mention the power imbalance of perception. In a courtroom full of flashing cameras, but that night there were no cameras yet. Just rain and pride and the sound of authority echoing into an empty sky. He went too far. Maybe it was instinct, maybe ego, a need to reassert control when he felt it slipping. He demanded she comply with an unnecessary order, something that violated her protocol as an officer. When she didn't move fast enough, his voice rose. He reached for her arm. Her stare stopped him mid-motion. Not anger, just calm certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Later, witnesses would describe it differently. Some said she'd been defiant. Others said she was composed. But the dashcam footage told a simpler story. A man used to being obeyed, meeting someone who didn't operate under fear. The rest unfolded quietly. A citation shoved into her hand, a muttered insult half swallowed by thunder, a promise that this isn't over. And it wasn't. She left without another word, taillights disappearing into the fog. The officer stood by his cruiser, soaked to the bone, staring after her with something close to confusion. He couldn't name it yet, but it was the beginning of the end. A crack forming in the certainty that his badge made him untouchable. By morning, the report was filed. By afternoon, his name was trending. Someone had recorded the exchange, not the words, but the tone. The imbalance. The shift. And when they realized who she was, a decorated army major returning from deployment, a woman who'd commanded troops in war zones, the public conversation changed overnight. The footage hit every major outlet within hours. Sergeant confronts female officer in uniform. Abuse of power or misunderstanding, when authority meets authority. He thought it would fade like the others, that the department would cover it, issue a statement, and move on. But this time, it didn't, because she filed a report of her own. Not to humiliate him, not to make a scene, but because something larger was at stake. Respect. Accountability. The line between authority and abuse. And when the summons arrived weeks later, it wasn't the officer who was in control anymore. He'd brought the wrong woman to court. The courthouse smelled of varnish and old secrets. Marble floors reflected muted light from the tall windows, and every footstep echoed like memory refusing to fade. Cameras lined the corridor, reporters whispering headlines before they were written. Somewhere in that hum of curiosity and judgment, the man with the badge adjusted his tie for the 5th time, his reflection staring back with a hint of unease. He'd been here before. Traffic hearings, departmental reviews, courtroom testimonies. But this was different. This wasn't about a suspect or a citation. This was about him. The story had travelled faster than any of them expected. The video clip was everywhere now, a flash of light, rain, and an image of his hand hovering too close to authority he didn't understand. Social feeds split into chaos, some defending the uniform, others calling it another chapter in a story people were tired of hearing. But inside this courtroom, there was no noise, just the weight of accountability pressing down from every corner. She arrived quietly, escorted by 2 officers from her base. No entourage, no announcement. Her uniform was pressed, medals polished, expression unreadable. If she felt anything, anger, humiliation, victory, it didn't show. Her composure was an armor stronger than any metal she'd ever worn. When she took her seat, the murmur in the room shifted. It wasn't just respect, it was awareness. The kind that ripples through people when they realize the person they dismissed carries more gravity than they imagined. The prosecutor began laying out the case, the footage, the testimony, the history of complaints against the sergeant. None had ever stuck. Until now. The defense tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a simple procedural misstep in bad weather, a lack of recognition, not malice. But every word felt hollow against the silence that followed. Because on that screen, replayed again and again, was the look on his face. Authority turning into fear the moment control slipped from his grasp. When the footage ended, no one spoke for a long time. The rain from that night seemed to echo in the silence. She didn't need to speak first. Her presence did the talking. Calm, deliberate, grounded. When it was finally her turn to testify, she rose, unhurried, her movements as precise as her words. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She explained. About the chain of command. About mutual respect among those who wear uniforms. About how discipline means restraint and power means protection, not domination. She spoke of integrity like it was oxygen, invisible but necessary for survival. And as she spoke, something changed. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, not out of authority but curiosity, as if realizing this case wasn't about law enforcement versus military protocol, but something older, something deeper. It was about the illusion of untouchability. Across the room, the sergeant watched her, trying to reconcile the image of the woman from the highway with the one now commanding an entire courtroom with nothing but composure. He could feel every glance from the jury, the quiet judgment in the air, not just of his actions but of what they represented. For years, he'd worn the badge like armor. It had shielded him from consequences, from reflection. But now it felt heavy, like a confession pinned to his chest. When the cross-examination began, the defense tried to catch her off balance, suggesting she'd escalated the situation, that her silence had been provocative. But she didn't flinch. Her answers were factual, unembellished, almost surgical in precision. Every question intended to discredit her became another brick in the wall of credibility she built around herself. By midday, the courtroom felt like a mirror held up to a system too used to looking away. The sergeant wasn't the only one on trial anymore. It was the culture that allowed arrogance to masquerade as authority, and silence to be mistaken for guilt. Outside, protesters gathered on both sides. Some waved flags. Others carried signs that read, "Respect is earned, not demanded." News anchors framed it as a culture war. But inside, it was quieter. The truth didn't need volume. It needed presence. By afternoon, the sergeant was called to the stand. The prosecutor asked simple questions, nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just facts. But each one peeled away a layer of his certainty. Why did you approach her the way you did? Why did you raise your voice? Why did you assume she wasn't in uniform authority? He answered, but his words stumbled under their own weight. The badge no longer made his tone credible. The uniform no longer guaranteed respect. By the time closing arguments began, the air had shifted. The courtroom wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, the simple truth that respect can't be forced with power, only earned through conduct. When the verdict was read, it wasn't explosive. No shouting, no celebration, just a slow exhale from the crowd. The department was ordered to issue a formal apology. The sergeant was suspended pending review. The court found procedural misconduct, abuse of authority, and a breach of federal protocol concerning inter-service treatment. But the real victory wasn't on paper. It was in the silence that followed, the kind that carries understanding instead of noise. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She stood, saluted the judge, and walked out the same way she had entered. Quietly, firmly, unshaken. Reporters flooded toward her, microphones thrust forward like weapons. She ignored them all. Outside, rain began to fall again, light at first, then heavier, as if the night that started it all was circling back for closure. The sergeant stepped outside minutes later. The cameras swarmed him too, but no one cheered, no one defended. He looked smaller now, the weight of his choices pressing harder than the verdict itself. Across the street, she paused under the awning of a coffee shop, watching the downpour blur the world into streaks of grey and gold. A group of young officers approached her, men and women from both services, silent, respectful, standing with her in the rain. Not out of sympathy, but acknowledgement. This wasn't just her win. It was a reminder that authority, unchecked, corrodes from within, that real strength is silent, measured, patient, and that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is composure. By nightfall, the headlines would shift again. Commentators would analyze, critics would debate, and think pieces would dissect every frame. But none of that mattered anymore, because the real story wasn't about the courtroom or the cameras. It was about a woman who didn't have to raise her voice to be heard, and a man who finally learned that a badge might demand respect, but it can never deserve it without integrity. On the day of the final judgment, the verdict rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Guilty. For a moment, the air itself seemed to pause. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and the man who once swaggered through life with a badge on his chest sat frozen in disbelief. His hands trembled as the bailiff approached, the same kind of firm, unflinching grip he used to command respect, now turning against him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He looked back, searching maybe, for someone to still believe him. But the benches behind were filled with faces that once turned away from truth. Now they looked on in silence, watching one of their own fall. The woman at the center of it all, her composure steady, her eyes unflinching, did not smile. Victory wasn't what she felt. It was something heavier. Vindication carries a weight all its own, one that settles deep in the bones. When the judge dismissed the court, the world outside was waiting. Microphones, questions, bright lights. How does it feel to finally get justice? What message do you have for other women like you? She didn't answer. The truth didn't need a press conference. It was already written across the day. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then relentless. He was led through it in handcuffs, his uniform long gone, replaced by grey fabric and shame. The same city that once cheered for him now turned its gaze away. In the days that followed, the story dominated headlines. Officer convicted after abuse of power exposed. Commentators dissected every detail, his rise, his arrogance, his fall. But somewhere buried between the analysis and outrage was a quieter narrative. How long it takes for people to believe a woman who refuses to be silenced. She stayed away from the cameras. The noise of justice had been loud enough. What she wanted now was peace. But peace doesn't arrive like a knock at the door. It sneaks in, quietly, after long nights of remembering and unlearning fear. He sat in a cell that echoed with his own thoughts. Pride is a cruel companion. It convinces you that your reflection can never shatter, until it does. Days turned into weeks and the letters began arriving. Some were from former colleagues, thin words of sympathy wrapped in cowardice. Others came from strangers, hate mail, threats, and the occasional twisted plea for forgiveness. But one day, a different letter arrived. No return address, just his name, written in careful, deliberate script. Inside, a single sheet of paper. You once told me the world bends to power. Maybe it does, but not forever. Some people stand even when power tries to break them. I stood. That's all I ever needed to do. No signature. But he knew. He folded it once, twice, before setting it on the cold metal desk. For the first time, he didn't feel anger. Just the kind of quiet that comes when you finally run out of excuses. Months later, during a hearing before his sentence was finalized, he asked to speak. The courtroom was smaller this time. No reporters, no spectacle. Just the judge, the lawyers, and the woman who changed everything. He stood, voice low but clear. I thought I could get away with anything. I thought my badge meant I didn't have to answer to anyone. But I was wrong. I destroyed something that can't be fixed. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just wanted to say it. Out loud. There was no applause, no redemption waiting at the end of his confession. Some things don't get closure. They just end. Afterward, she walked out of the courthouse one last time. The steps were slick with rain again, and the city hummed below, oblivious, alive, indifferent. She didn't look back. In the months that followed, her name became a symbol. People quoted her testimony, wrote articles about her courage, and called her a hero. But she didn't see herself that way. Heroes changed the world. She only wanted to stop one man from believing he owned it. She rebuilt her life in pieces, a new apartment. New friends. A job that didn't make her shrink into silence. The world was still dangerous, still unfair, but now it couldn't scare her the same way. Sometimes she'd walk past a patrol car and feel her stomach tighten. Trauma doesn't vanish, it lingers in flashes. But she'd keep walking, always forward. Years later, at a community forum about justice reform, someone asked if she believed people like him could ever truly change. She paused before answering. Change isn't the point, she said. Accountability is. The room went quiet. Somewhere in another city, behind tall walls and barbed wire, the man who once thought himself untouchable worked in silence. Prison uniforms have no rank. Every morning he lined up like everyone else. No salutes, no titles, just a number. But sometimes, late at night, he'd take out that folded letter. The ink had faded, but the words hadn't. He'd read it again and again, the same line catching his breath each time. I stood. Maybe that was the apology he'd never earn, the reminder that in the end, the only thing stronger than power was the truth that stood against it. The world moved on. New scandals, new trials, new outrage. But for the woman who once walked into a courtroom alone, justice wasn't a headline. It was survival. And survival, she learned, was louder than any badge.